She was 20 and banished. No family left to take her in, no roof of her own, just a small carved maple, stirring paddle worn warm by 4 generations of women's hands, a single thumbed page from her Mamie's cookbook sewn into the lining of her wool coat pocket, and 4 single-dollar bills she had earned scrubbing pans at a small lumberjack diner outside Marquette. And with that $4, she bought a long, log-built logging cookshack standing alone at the edge of a deep stand of bur oak and sugar maple at the end of Beauchesne Camp Road in the small French-Canadian village of Beauchesne Hollow in Marquette County, Michigan, in a stretch of the Upper Peninsula Northwoods that had not heard the slow scrape of a long iron ladle across a cast-iron camp stove since the autumn of 1961. The cedar shake roof had silvered and split along the south pitch. The chinked log wall had loosened at the back corner. But what nobody knew, least of all Céline Beauchesne herself, was that pressed flat and sealed in oilcloth beneath the hand-pegged white pine floorboards of the cookshack's back pantry, packed inside a hand-built cedar chest, was something her Mamie and her Mamie's Mamie had cured and set down there across 128 years that would change her life forever. Before we go on, if you love stories like these, take a moment and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. We love to see how far these stories travel. She had seen the cookshack on a hand-printed card thumbtacked to the bulletin board of the small Marquette County Co-op in Negaunee in soft pencil. Logging cookshack, half-acre, woods frontage, $4 or best offer. See Mr. Edward Pelletier at the courthouse. She had $6.10 folded in the inside pocket of her wool coat, the last of 3 weeks of diner wages. She walked the half-mile down to the small Marquette County courthouse on a cool Tuesday morning in early October, with the sugar maples just beginning to flame red across the Upper Peninsula ridges, and she asked the woman at the front desk for Mr. Edward Pelletier by name. Mr. Edward Pelletier was 80 years old and had been the deputy clerk of Marquette County for 54 of those years. He looked up at her when she said her name and went very still. "Beauchesne," he said slowly. "The woods in the word. From Beauchesne Hollow. You'd be Hortense's great-granddaughter, then." Céline nodded once. He folded his hands and walked back into a small storeroom and came back with a heavy iron key on a piece of plain hemp twine. $4, he said. "We have been keeping this key 64 years. Your Mamie left it with my father back in 1961, and she told him plain, hand this to whichever Beauchesne girl walks back up the camp road asking after the cookshack." She paid him 4 soft paper dollars and signed her name. He walked her to the door and set his old hand for 1 second on her shoulder. "You go on up there before the first hard frost, ma chère," he said. "The cookshack has been waiting on you a long while." She had grown up with the smell of rendered pork lard and sourdough, with the deep, warm, smoky smell of side pork curing slow in a wooden salt pork barrel in the back pantry of a working logging cookshack, with the dry, sharp smell of seasoned sugar maple coals burning slow in a long cast-iron camp stove on a cold November morning, with the cool, clean smell of fresh sourdough being mixed by hand in a long wooden dough trough at 4 in the morning before the lumberjacks woke, with the warm, amber smell of beeswax being rubbed slow into the carved maple handle of a long, stirring paddle to keep the wood from cracking in the wet, and with the deep, cool, dusk smell of the deep north woods themselves, breathing slow out of the bur oak and sugar maple stands on a warm August evening, woodsy and old and full of years. She had grown up sitting on a low cedar stool at the long pine kitchen table in her Mamie's logging cookshack when she was 3 and 4 years old, watching her Mamie's long brown-spotted hands stir a long carved maple paddle slow through a deep cast-iron stew kettle simmering on the camp stove, lifting the deep amber pork and bean stew with a slow patience that did not look like work, but like listening. Her Mamie was Hortense Beauchesne, born in 1940 in the same small frame cabin at the foot of Beauchesne Camp Road, where Céline would later be born, the only daughter of Pierre and Yvette Beauchesne. She had learned the cookshack and the salt pork barrel at the side of her own mother on the same long cast-iron camp stove and the same carved maple stirring paddle her great-grandmother had carved from a single piece of Upper Peninsula sugar maple in 1897. Hortense was tall and thin, with the long brown-spotted hands of an Upper Peninsula cookwoman, her white hair worn in a single tight braid pinned at the back of her neck under a faded red plaid wool cap. Céline had called her Mamie from the first day she could shape the sound. Céline's mother, Marguerite, had gone to Detroit when Céline was 3 and had not come back, and Céline's father, Jean-Baptiste, had been killed in a logging accident outside Munising when she was 9, so the years had belonged to Mamie from the time Céline could carry a wooden flour scoop without spilling. She learned to tell a side of fresh pork shoulder from a side of fresh pork belly by the marbling of the white before she could read. By 8, she could draw a long maple paddle through a deep stew kettle in a single, slow, even pass without sloshing a single drop. By 12, she could read a barrel. She could stand at her Mamie's elbow at the long pine kitchen table in the back pantry and see, before her Mamie told her, whether a side of pork in the salt pork barrel had 2 more weeks of cure or 4, whether the dry rock salt and the dry maple sugar in the barrel were drawing the brine clean and true, or whether the autumn dampness had drifted in through the chinked log wall and the next side would have to be moved deeper into the barrel, whether the small living sourdough starter in the small earthen crock on the back corner of the camp stove was running true to the Acadian family line, or whether the long Upper Peninsula winter had chilled the culture, and the starter needed a fresh feeding of warm whole milk before the next batch of camp bread. By 18, she had cooked her own shift of the lumberjack camp through 4 full logging seasons, sealed 43 small glass jars of saved Acadian sourdough starter, and dried heritage Acadian cure spice and Upper Peninsula salt pork brine cultures under the white pine floorboards in her own hand, and learned every one of the 17 Acadian line Cookshack signs Mamie said a Beauchesne woman had to know before she was allowed to seal a jar of her own under her own initials. Mamie, on a warm Saturday morning in October in Céline's 18th year, walked out of the small logging cookshack with a single warm loaf of fresh sourdough camp bread wrapped in clean linen and laid it in Céline's hands at the cookshack step and said, "You are a Beauchesne woman now, ma chère. The salt knows you, the paddle knows you, the cookshack knows you." And then she said, in her quiet way, "And there is one thing your Mamie has not yet shown you, because the cookshack herself had to choose the morning. Come down to the back pantry with me." But before Céline or Hortense, there had been Anastasia. Anastasia Beauchesne had come down off a rail car at the port of Sault Ste. Marie in the autumn of 1896, 20 years old, with her young husband Octave Beauchesne, a small wooden trunk holding everything they owned, and a single oilcloth-wrapped bundle holding the carved maple-stirring paddle her grandmother had handed her at the dock in Caraquet. A small earthen crock of dried Acadian sourdough starter culture her own mother had been feeding warm whole milk every other day since 1843. A small leather pouch of saved heritage Acadian cure spice from her own mother's small Caraquet salt pork barrel on the Acadian shore, and the rough plans for an Upper Peninsula logging cookshack her grandmother had drawn out on a piece of brown butcher paper. The Beauchesne had walked south from Sault Ste. Marie into the deep northwoods of the Upper Peninsula in the spring of 1897, and they had stopped at the edge of a deep stand of bur oak and sugar maple at the end of a long narrow camp road because the deep northwoods ran cool and old the way the deep Caraquet woods had run, and a small clear branch came down off the back ridge clean and cold the way the small streams had come down off the Acadian shore. And Anastasia had stood at the edge of the stand on a warm April afternoon, and she had said to Octave, in the slow, careful English she was still learning, "This is the place. The cookshack belongs here. We will not go further." She had been 20. She had no money to speak of, and no flock yet broken, and no one in the Upper Peninsula who believed a young Acadian immigrant woman could build a working logging cookshack at the edge of a sugar maple stand with her own 2 hands. But Anastasia had set her hand on a fresh white pine log, and she had begun. She and Octave built the cookshack through the spring and summer of 1897, hand-shaping the white pine logs of the long, low walls, chinking the gaps with hand-mixed lime mortar and dry sphagnum moss, hand-laying a cedar shake roof on hand-hewn pine rafters, fitting the long cast-iron camp stove against the front wall, building a long pine kitchen table down the center, and building a small back pantry at the rear with hand-pegged white pine floorboards over a shallow back pantry storage pit, and a wooden salt pork barrel set against the back wall. Anastasia cooked her first shift for a small logging crew on the long camp stove in October of 1897. She kept the Cookshack for 54 years. She trained her granddaughter Yvette at her side, and Yvette trained her daughter Hortense, and the Cookshack at Beauchesne Hollow held its kettle and its salt pork barrel and its women without a single empty logging winter for 64 years, through Anastasia and Yvette and Hortense, until the autumn of 1961, when Hortense was 21 and her own mother Yvette had just gone, and Hortense banked the last fire in the camp stove on a cool October evening and walked back down to the small frame cabin in Beauchesne Hollow and did not open the Cookshack again for 64 years. Mamie had 3 rules for the salt. The first was this: the salt is the teacher. You do not cure the pork, ma chère. The dry rock salt and the dry maple sugar, and the slow cool of the upper peninsula October, and the long, even dark of the back pantry cure the pork, and you only stand at the wooden barrel with the paddle in your hands, and you read what the salt is telling you, and you do what it is asking. A cookwoman who thinks she decides what the barrel will give her is a cookwoman who will spoil one side in 3 and feed a crew of 40 hungry lumberjacks half-cured pork at first light, because the salt will turn against her by the second cure. The second was this: the Cookshack is the keeper. The hand-shaped white pine logs and the chinked lime and moss walls and the cedar shake roof and the long cast-iron camp stove and the long pine kitchen table and the small back pantry with the wooden salt pork barrel and the hand-pegged white pine floorboards over the shallow storage pit are not a kitchen. They are a sleeping place and a workshop and a cure room and a saving place for the family line, all in one 40-foot log building set at the edge of a sugar maple stand. A cookwoman who thinks she cures the family pork in a household kitchen is a cookwoman who is fooling herself. The Cookshack is the keeper. The third was this: the starter is the family. The small dried Acadian sourdough starter and the small saved Acadian cure, spice your great-great-grandmother carried out of Caraquet in 1896, have been kept in small glass jars under the hand-pegged white pine floorboards of the back pantry for 128 years. Never once gone soft, never once gone foul, never once allowed to dry out in a careless summer. We refresh the starter with warm whole milk 3 times a week. We reseal each spice and starter jar with a hand-pressed beeswax and cotton cloth lid. We never lift the jars from the cool cedar dark of the back pantry pit unless the next Beauchesne woman is at the kitchen table learning to feed the starter in her own hand. And when a Beauchesne woman is gone, the next Beauchesne woman lifts the white pine floorboard the same October morning, refreshes the starter in the same small earthen crock, and reseals the spice jars in her own hand. Mind the starter and the cure spice above the other 2, ma chère. The Cookshack can be rechinked, the paddle can be rubbed with beeswax, the camp stove can be reblackened. The starter and the heritage Acadian cure spice cannot be replaced. Mamie died in November of 2023, on a cold, rainy afternoon, in her chair beside the small wood stove in the small frame cabin in Beauchesne Hollow, with the open-thumbed cookbook in her lap and a small earthen crock of warm Acadian starter on the side table beside her. The doctor said it was her heart. Céline was 19. She did not cry. She came home from her shift at the lumberjack diner and found Mamie in the chair, and she sat down on the floor beside the chair and laid her cheek against Mamie's cool hand, and she stayed there until the funeral home came. She fed the starter herself that night, with a small ladle of warm, whole milk in her own careful young hand. And only when the crock was set back on the cool corner of the wood stove did she sit down beside the cold wood stove and finally let herself cry. The small frame cabin in Beauchesne Hollow belonged to the county because Mamie had taken a small reverse mortgage on it during her last sickness, and within 5 months of Mamie's funeral, the county had come and asked Céline to be out by the 1st of October. She had left, with the small carved maple stirring paddle Mamie had pressed into her hand on her last clear afternoon, the single-thumbed page torn carefully from Mamie's cookbook, sewn into the lining of her wool coat pocket, the small earthen crock of warm Acadian starter, wrapped in 2 clean dish towels and a wool sweater, a small canvas bag of her clothes, and the photograph of 3 women, standing at the camp stove door of the Cookshack in 1948. If these stories are reaching you tonight, take a second to subscribe. It truly does help us keep making them. And tell us in the comments, was there ever a small living thing in your family that someone kept warm and fed for years on end? A starter, a cure, a sourdough crock that you carry with you from a woman who is no longer here. The half-mile walk up Beauchesne Camp Road from the small frame cabin to the edge of the deep stand of bur oak and sugar maple was longer than she remembered, because the deep north woods opened slow and red and gold around her as she walked, and the late afternoon light came down soft and warm across the open camp road. The sugar maples were flaming deep crimson along the back ridge. A pair of white-tailed deer crossed the road in front of her on slow, careful hooves. A small, clear branch came down off the back ridge clean and cold over rounded fieldstones along the right of the road. She found the foundation of the small frame cabin first, 4 courses of fieldstone in a square of new Northwoods moss, and beyond the foundation, set at the edge of the deep stand of bur oak and sugar maple under the open arc of an upper peninsula sky, the small logging Cookshack. 40 feet long, 16 feet wide, single story, the hand-shaped white pine logs of the long, low walls silvered by 64 winters of cold, the chinked lime and moss walls loosened at the back corner, the cedar shake roof silvered and split along the south pitch and patched with green Northwoods moss, a low porch step at the front door, a single dark rust-iron camp stove chimney rising through the south pitch of the roof gone cold, a hand-built oak door warped on hand-forged iron strap hinges rusted dark and laced shut, 64 autumns of fallen sugar maple leaves banked deep against the porch step at the door, the deep crimson sugar maples and the deep gold bur oaks of the stand rising tall around the Cookshack to the back ridge. She did not cry. She brushed the dry maple leaves from the porch step with her boot, fitted the heavy iron key into the small, hand-forged iron lock plate set into the oak door frame at hip height, worked the key gently for the better part of 2 minutes until the wards remembered how to turn, and then the bolt slid back with a small dry sound, and the oak door eased open on its iron hinges with the slow groan of a door that has held shut for 64 winters. The cool, dry breath of the Cookshack came out to meet her, the dim, warm pine and pork smell of oiled maple and old beeswax, and the faint, sharp ghost of 128 years of salt-cured side pork and sourdough camp bread. She stood at the door a long minute. Then she lit her Mamie's small brass kerosene lantern, and she stepped into the Cookshack. The Cookshack was 40 feet of slow, dim pine-warm air, the hand-shaped white pine log walls cool and pale silver inside, the chinked lime and moss walls dark in the gaps, the cedar shake roof above her low and warm-smelling of cedar, the hand-pegged white pine floor worn smooth by 64 years of bare and booted feet. The long cast-iron camp stove against the south wall, with a small bundle of dry sugar maple kindling still laid in its long firebox. The long pine kitchen table running down the center, 16 feet long, scrubbed pale by 64 years of pine soap and water. A long iron ladle and a long iron pot fork still hanging on hand-forged iron hooks above the camp stove. The small back pantry at the rear, the wooden salt pork barrel still set against the back wall, a small cypress shelf above the barrel holding 3 small wooden boxes of dry rock salt and dry maple sugar. And in the dim, warm air of the back pantry, low at first and then growing in her ears as her ear settled, was the soft, cool pine and salt smell of 3 generations of saved Acadian starter and Acadian cure spice sealed beneath her feet. She knelt slowly on the worn, hand-pegged white pine floor of the back pantry beside the wooden salt pork barrel. She remembered very clearly a thing Mamie had said one summer afternoon over coffee at the kitchen table in Beauchesne Hollow when Celine was 16. The good Beauchesne Cookshacks, ma chère. We keep what is dearest pressed in oilcloth and packed in a hand-built cedar chest beneath the second hand-pegged white pine floorboard from the salt pork barrel, in the shallow cedar and sand dark of the back pantry pit, because cedar holds glass and starter against damp and frost better than any cellar in any farmhouse, and no thief who has never stirred a long maple paddle through a deep cast-iron stew kettle at first light in a cold October dawn would think to lift the hand-pegged white pine floorboards of a logging Cookshack and look for what a Beauchesne woman has set down there. Céline lifted the second-hand pegged white pine floorboard from the salt pork barrel, the one Mamie had loosened on her own hand a long time before. Beneath the floorboard, set into a shallow hollow of dry cedar shavings and dry Upper Peninsula sand in the back pantry pit, sealed in a long, dark oilcloth bundle tied with weathered hemp twine, lay the cedar chest. She lifted it out carefully. It was heavier than she had expected. She set the chest on the long pine kitchen table and untied the hemp twine of the oilcloth slow with her fingers, and she opened the oilcloth fold by fold, and inside, the hand-built cedar chest, the lid carved on its top with 3 small joined letter B's. She lifted the lid, and inside, packed in a thin bed of dry rock salt and dry cedar shavings, lay the jars, 43 of them. Small, clean glass jars sealed with hand-pressed beeswax and cotton cloth lids tied with linen string, some holding small, careful suspensions of dried Acadian sourdough starter culture in pale cream powder, some holding small, careful suspensions of saved heritage. Acadian cure spice in deep amber and rust red and pale tan grain, some holding small careful suspensions of dry Upper Peninsula salt pork brine culture from the working barrel, each jar with a small slip of waxed paper tied to it with linen string, carrying the year and the line and the woman's full name. Anastasia, Acadian starter, 1897, first jar. Anastasia, Caraquet Cure Spice, 1901. Anastasia, Salt Pork Brine Culture, 1904. Anastasia, Acadian Starter Refresh, 1912. Anastasia, Caraquet Cure Spice, 1921. Yvette, Acadian Starter, 1930. First jar under her own initials. Yvette, Caraquet Cure Spice, 1938. Yvette, Salt Pork Brine Culture, 1947. Hortense, Acadian Starter, 1958, first jar under her own initials. Hortense, Caraquet Cure Spice, 1961, the last jar Mamie had sealed in the back pantry before she had banked the last camp stove fire for 64 winters. The slow, Acadian-line Cookshack keeping of 3 generations of women, sealed in glass and dry salt in a hand-built cedar chest beneath the white pine floorboards of an Upper Peninsula logging cookshack for 6 decades. Beneath the jars in the cool cedar dark of the chest lay a small flat tin box with a hinged lid and a small leather pouch. Céline lifted the tin. Inside was the original cookbook, thick, sewn together with linen thread, the cover of soft-tanned oilskin, the pages of cotton paper hand-cut and hand-ruled, and on every page, in the careful old hands of 3 generations of Beauchesne women, was the whole record of the cookshack. The starter feed, the dough rise, the salt barrel layer, the cure week, the kettle stew, the crew count, the bread bake, the maple sugar pull, the wax lid seal, page after page after page, 128 years of careful Acadian-line Upper Peninsula cookshack keeping. Inside the small leather pouch lay 17 small American gold coins, $5 pieces from the 1870s and 80s, the gold Anastasia had carried out of Caraquet in the lining of her coat. And folded into the back of the cookbook, sealed with a drop of warm, dark beeswax gone hard as amber, was a single letter, the wax still whole, addressed in long, careful old French-Canadian tinged penmanship, to the granddaughter who lifts the floorboard. From Anastasia Beauchesne, Cuisinière, Beauchesne Hollow, 1898. She broke the wax seal with her thumb and read the letter aloud to the cookshack because there was no one else to read it to, and the slow, dim jars were the only thing listening. To the granddaughter who lifts the floorboard. If you are reading this, you have walked up Beauchesne Camp Road with a key in your hand, and you have brushed the maple leaves from the porch step, and you have turned the bolt, and you have lit a lantern in the dim, and you have known to kneel at the salt pork barrel and lift the second-hand pegged white pine floorboard, and you are a Beauchesne woman, and the cookshack has called you home. My name is Anastasia Beauchesne. I was born Anastasia Cormier in the small Acadian shore village of Caraquet on the north coast of New Brunswick in the autumn of 1876, the eldest of 4 daughters, and the only one my grandmother taught the salt pork barrel and the paddle and the saved starter, because I was the only one who would sit still long enough to learn to listen to the salt. I came across the Gulf with my husband Octave in the autumn of 1896, with a small oilcloth bundle of the maple paddle and the dried starter, and the saved karikay cure spice, and the rough plans my grandmother had drawn out on a piece of brown butcher paper, and I walked south from Sault Ste. Marie into this deep Upper Peninsula Northwoods in the spring of 1897. And I stood at the edge of this deep stand of bur oak and sugar maple on a warm April afternoon. And I knew, the way a woman knows a thing once and keeps it for 50 years, that the Cookshack was here. I built this Cookshack with my own 2 hands and octaves across the spring and summer of 1897, and I cooked my first shift for a small logging crew on the long camp stove in October, and I sealed my first jar of starter and saved karikay cure spice beneath the white pine floorboards of the back pantry in November. The jars in the cedar chest below this letter, ma chère, are not money. They are not gold. They are the family. The Cookshack can be re-chinked, the roof can be re-shingled, the paddle can be rubbed with beeswax, the kettle can be re-blackened. The starter and the heritage Acadian cure spice, fed once with warm milk and salted once in dry rock salt, are the family kept in cedar and salt and the slow Upper Peninsula dark. The gold in the pouch is the small gold I carried out of karikay, and I trust you will not spend it for any reason other than to mend this cedar shake roof or re-chink this log wall or buy fresh rock salt from a Marquette store in a year your own salt runs thin. Do not move the jars. Do not unseal the wax lids unless you mean to set the cure in a clean barrel. Do not be greedy with the jars in the chest. Lift 1 jar to the food historian who comes asking after pre-war Acadian heritage culinary bloodlines, and lay the rest of the jars in the cedar chest the way you found them, and close the oak door at sundown the way a Beauchesne woman has closed the door of this Cookshack at sundown for 64 years. With my whole hand and my whole heart, Anastasia Beauchesne, cuisinière, Beauchesne Hollow, Marquette County, Michigan, the 14th of October, 1898. Céline laid the letter flat on the long pine kitchen table. She set her open palm across it. She did not cry. She closed her eyes and breathed in the cool pine and salt smell of the Cookshack and the faint, warm, sweet ghost of 128 years of saved Acadian starter and karikay cure spice, and the tight thing that had lived in her chest since the cold November afternoon she had walked into Mamie's kitchen, loosened. The name of the loosening was home. She drove the gold pieces down to a careful coin dealer in Marquette the following week, a man named Mr. Leopold Gagnon, who valued the 17 small $5 gold pieces at $38,400. She sold 5 of them. She put $11,000 in a savings account at the Marquette County Bank, and she walked back up Beauchesne Camp Road with a fresh bundle of cedar shakes for the south pitch of the roof, 2 coils of new hemp twine, a small bag of fresh rock salt from a Marquette store, a fresh cake of beeswax, and a small can of new kerosene for Mamie's lantern. She did not move the jars. The jars stayed where Anastasia and Yvette and Hortense had sealed them, in the cool cedar dark of the chest beneath the white pine floorboards. But she did, that first November, walk down off the porch step with a single small warm loaf of fresh sourdough camp bread wrapped in clean linen and a small thick slice of slow-cured side pork to the older women of Beauchesne Hollow and Nagaunet. Mrs. Yvette LeBlanc, 86, who had been a girl when Anastasia cured her last side. Mrs. Hortense Tremblay, 82, whose grandmother had been Anastasia's first Cookshack customer. Each one took the small warm loaf and the slice of pork in their old hands and looked at them for a long time. Each one said the same thing in some form. We had begun to wonder if any of you would come back, and in the early spring, an older woman drove up the camp road from the University of Michigan Heritage Food Research Project, who had been searching for 30 years for surviving pre-war Acadian sourdough starter cultures and karikay cure spice bloodlines presumed extinct, and she stood in the open oak door of the Cookshack on a warm March afternoon with her hand against her mouth, looking at the rows of small glass jars of saved starter and cure spice under the lantern amber, and she said only, "Please, ma chère, please let me come back with the lab." That is the thing about the Cookshack keeping our grandmothers teach us, the slow kind, the kind we learn at a long pine kitchen table with a carved maple stirring paddle when we are 3 years old. It is not really about the meal. The meal is the wage. The starter is the trade. The trade is the small jars sealed in dry rock salt and dry cedar shavings in a hand-built cedar chest beneath the white pine floorboards of an Upper Peninsula logging cookshack for 128 years, and the slow scrape of a long iron ladle across a long cast-iron camp stove at first light in a cold October dawn, and the small earthen crock of warm Acadian starter set on the cool corner of a camp stove and fed warm milk by a Beauchesne hand every other day for 128 years. The trade is, above all, the truth Anastasia wrote in her letter on the 14th of October, 1898. The starter is the family. The cookshack is the keeper. The salt is the teacher. We are only the next pair of hands. Céline Beauchesne was 20 years old and banished. She had $4 to her name, and she spent them on a long, log-built logging cookshack standing alone at the edge of a deep stand of bur oak and sugar maple at the end of Beauchesne Camp Road in Beauchesne Hollow in Marquette County, Michigan. It was the best $4 she ever spent. If this story has kept you company tonight, thank you for sitting up with us. Sleep well, breathe easy, and see you in the last warm light of the day.